If you think the worst cold waits outside the castle gates, the real shock hits the moment you step inside. The temperature drops so sharply, it feels like the entire castle is holding its breath. Each time you exhale, the air doesn't just turn into mist, it crystallizes into tiny frost grains that cling to your hair and eyelashes. The cold feels pressurized, sliding straight into your lungs and scraping down your chest until you instinctively hunch forward. The stone floor beneath your feet sends up a needle-sharp chill. Stand still for a few seconds and your toes begin to numb, as if the cold is erasing them one by one. Then comes the first sound, this thin, metallic crack echoing along the walls. It isn't footsteps, it's the stone itself contracting in the night, a sound so sharp it could make any guard whip around in fear. In the corner, the water jar left out for the night has turned into a cloudy block of ice, silent proof that the room has fallen to temperatures most people today only experience inside a freezer. Look around long enough, and you'll understand why those who lived in castles described winter with a single chilling line. The wind outside kills slowly, the cold in here kills without a sound. Now imagine surviving even one night like that. Would you plant yourself as close to the hearth as possible? Wrap yourself in every layer you own? Or try to carve out your own tiny shelter against the cold? Castle architecture was engineered to stop armies, but it accidentally became an unstoppable cold-sucking machine. Those thick stone walls that look so solid, they act like giant ice blocks, draining every bit of warmth the moment it appears. The ceilings rise so high that any flame you build just gets swallowed upward, leaving only swirling drafts biting at your ankles. And that strategic location on high ground, facing the strongest winds, it turns the castle into a place where cold air can slide through every tiny gap without resistance. Each gust doesn't simply pass through. It slices in thin, blade-like sheets, slipping through poorly sealed gates, racing down narrow corridors, and firing straight into the Great Hall. Every time those massive doors swing open, what little warmth the room has is sucked out in an instant, dropping the temperature back to nearly whatever it is outside. The architects weren't wrong, they simply never imagined that the very features designed to save lives in war would threaten those same lives in winter. So let me ask you this. If you had to live in a fortress built like that, would you trade safety for a bit more warmth, or endure skin-cutting cold in exchange for an unbreakable stronghold? What surprises most people today isn't the cold inside a castle, but the fact that the cold didn't come from winter winds at all. It came from the building materials themselves. Medieval mortar, the stuff everyone assumes is just rock glued to rock, was the tencha de vergrem, silent traitor. When dry, it looks solid. But after just a few winters, the tiny sand particles inside start to separate, creating countless microfractures so thin you can barely see them. And those hairline cracks become thousands of miniature wind tunnels, letting icy air slip in, travel through the walls, and blow straight into the room like a breath from a frozen underworld. The windows weren't any better. No glass, just warped wooden shutters that time had bent out of shape. Even when closed, they never truly sealed. Wind slipped through the gaps and turned into long, high-pitched whistles cold enough to make you think someone was whispering right beside your ear. And here's the twist that shocked researchers. When people tried to plug a big gap using wood or thick fabric, the cold didn't go away. Because the cold wasn't entering from the obvious spots, it was leaking in through hundreds of invisible pinholes across the walls, floors, and doors. You seal one place, but the entire castle keeps bleeding heat like a giant sieve. That's why people in castles didn't fear the storms outside, they feared the drafts they could never see. Now imagine living in a room where the cold hits you from every direction at once. Which spot would you fix first? Drop your theory in the comments. Sometimes the simplest idea is the one it took the Middle Ages centuries to figure out. Most people think the gloom inside a medieval castle came from war, armored knights, or centuries of gray stone soaked in history. But the truth is simpler and far more unsettling. Light couldn't defeat the cold. Tiny arrow-slit windows, designed to stop enemy fire rather than let daylight in, allowed only a few thin strands of light to slip through. The rest of the room drowned in a darkness that felt thick, cold, and heavy like frozen fog. Even when torches were lit, the flame never stood a chance. Drafts slipping through invisible cracks made the fire shiver, dance, then choke out halfway. The light was so weak that objects appeared only as shifting black silhouettes, and the person standing across from you was lit only on one side as if they were hiding inside their own shadow. Candles burned faster than normal because cold air kept spiraling around them, filling the room with the smell of melting wax and smoky residue, and yet the place still didn't feel any warmer. The strangest sight came during the deepest winter days. Torch smoke didn't rise. It hovered midair, trapped by the cold, forming a thin, ghostly haze that made everything look distorted, like a bad dream you couldn't wake from. Medieval people got so used to darkness that they stopped fearing it. What they feared was the feeling of being swallowed by the cold even while standing right next to a flame. So if you imagine yourself in that room, what would scare you more? A darkness that feels alive, or the silent cold creeping into every breath you take? The oldest heating method in a castle. The hearth and the fireplace sounds familiar, almost comforting. But in reality, they were so weak it's hard to believe. A central hearth in the Great Hall looks warm and noble in paintings. Yet in real life, it created a tiny warm bubble, no bigger than the radius of the flames themselves. Take just a few steps back, and you're instantly swallowed again by cold that feels almost identical to the temperature outside. Worse, the smoke from the hearth shot straight up to the ceiling. Then, pushed around by drafts leaking through the stonework, it curled back down and flooded the entire room. People sitting nearby ended up with burning eyes, difficulty breathing, and cloaks that reeked of smoke for days afterward. When castles later switched to wall-mounted fireplaces, the smoke problem improved, but a new shock appeared. The fireplace only heated the front of your body. Your back stayed as cold as if you were standing next to a block of ice. Historians wrote about a scene that was both humorous and painful. Servants constantly turning themselves like rotisserie chickens, warming their backs for a moment, then spinning around so their faces wouldn't burn. No matter how much wood they burned, it was never enough. A large hall could devour an entire cart of firewood in a single day, turning heating into a brutal war of attrition that lasted all winter. And because firewood was expensive, everyone crowded into one single room around the flames. Privacy disappeared, and the cold waited patiently on the other side of every door that opened. In medieval castles cold enough to crack stone overnight, every idea of boundaries, distance, or privacy collapsed under one simple truth: no one could survive alone. When a fireplace could only warm a space barely the size of a hand, everyone from lord to servant was forced to gather into a tight circle around the trembling flames struggling against the drafts. What happened next felt less like daily life and more like a secret ritual. A body climate formed, where one person's warmth became the only shield protecting the next from the cold lurking in the dark. Each breath rose as white mist, mingling in midair, sometimes drifting straight onto someone's face and startling them. Not because of intimacy, but because even your breath had become part of the survival strategy. When night came, they didn't sleep beside each other out of affection. They lay together out of desperation. The weak slept between the strong. Children disappeared under shared cloaks, and the adults formed a living barricade to block the icy drafts crawling up from the stone floor. On the coldest nights, the whole room seemed to merge into a single organism. Many bodies, but only one rhythm of breathing. Many people, but functioning like one trembling creature that tightened together each time the wind hissed through the walls. Whispers, rustling fabric, and the soft crackle of burning wood blended into a survival symphony that modern people could hardly imagine. If you had to sleep pressed against dozens of others just to keep a fragile thread of warmth alive, would you see it as a loss of freedom or the last piece of luck you had left? Share your thoughts. Sometimes one small perspective reveals the bigger truth about how our ancestors endured winters that refused to show mercy. In the bone-deep cold of a medieval castle, where stone walls acted like giant slabs of ice that drained every bit of warmth, the thing that saved lives wasn't fire, it was fabric. Massive tapestries so heavy they required several people to hang weren't just decorations or displays of wealth. They were silent armor against the cold. Once raised, they transformed the room instantly, not with color or beauty, but by blocking thousands of invisible drafts crawling through the stone. But here's the twist that leaves modern people stunned. Tapestries didn't just insulate walls, they were used to build secret rooms inside larger rooms. Medieval families would pull the curtains down, section off a small corner, and turn it into a heat pocket where their own breath could gather and create a private microclimate. Inside, the air was just a few degrees warmer, but in those winters, a few degrees meant the difference between survival and surrender. Beds were wrapped in heavy drapes, thick as tent canvas. Once closed, body heat bounced back, forming a world completely separate from the freezing air only inches away on the other side of the fabric. Nights were so still you could hear the faint stretching of the cloth as the temperature rose from human breath alone. When the last flame in the fireplace dies, with a soft gasp like a breath being strangled, the entire room drops to below freezing within minutes.
Did you send
It
a
happens
message?
so fast that medieval people describe the sensation as winter attacking from the inside. And in that moment, the bed becomes the final defensive line, a tiny fortress holding back an ocean of cold. A curtain bed wasn't decoration, it was a survival tent. When the heavy drapes fell shut, the narrow space inside trapped every scrap of body heat, creating a warm pocket a few degrees higher than the rest of the room. They pulled thick fur blankets over themselves, feeling the pelts hug back with their dense insulation, while beneath them, a cloth-wrapped hot stone released a soft, mist-like warmth barely visible, but absolutely vital. But the most dangerous moment came when a strong gust swept through the corridor. The bed curtain lifted just a few centimeters, yet that tiny gap was enough to suck all the warmth out in an instant, like opening the lid of a pot of boiling water. The sleeper would jolt awake as the sudden cold slapped against their skin, scrambling to pull the drapes shut again, as if they were saving their own life. In a medieval castle, fuel wasn't just a resource, it was power. The towering woodpile in the courtyard wasn't merely a stock of firewood, it was the fortress's survival battery. One glance at a lord's woodpile told you everything about his strength and his chances of making it through a brutal winter. But that display of abundance only looked impressive when the stack was full. As soon as it began to shrink, as soon as the last logs exposed the bottom, the entire castle slipped into quiet panic. When the good firewood ran out, people turned to dried dung. It burned fast and hot, but the sharp, throat-stinging smell was something nobody liked to talk about. The warm, humid heat rising from the burning patties crept into every corner of the room, filling the air with a warmth that was comforting and acrid at the same time, a truth nobles tried to hide, though everyone knew it. And when peat was available, they lit it like a miracle. Peat didn't blaze. It smoldered in the dark like buried embers, glowing under ash, lingering for hours, just enough to keep the room from slipping into freezing temperatures. But the most terrifying moment came with a snowstorm. One single night was enough to choke the supply routes, trap the firewood cart in the valley, and push the entire castle to the brink of freezing to death. The hearths went dark, water turned to ice in the basins, and every pair of eyes locked onto the woodpile now reduced to a thin, pitiful layer. If you think medieval castles were doomed to freeze forever, this is where the story flips.
Are you not cold?
Architecture started fighting back. And that change didn't come from magic, it came from centuries of observation, failure, and desperate experimentation. When lords finally realized stone walls could never defeat winter, they began building differently. Rooms were made smaller to retain heat, ceilings were lowered, doors thickened, and each entry was layered with fabric or leather. Some castles even created air pockets by using double hollow walls, a technique modern people assume belongs only to insulated construction. That empty space trapped warmth, turning each wall from a cold-draining enemy into a quiet thermal shield. Then came the bolder innovations, warm air channels built inside the walls, carrying heat from a single hearth into multiple rooms, glass windows appearing in wealthy castles, expensive, but better at stopping drafts than any heavy curtain, and caldariums, dedicated warm rooms, used as recovery stations after long councils or icy dinners in the Great Hall. The peak of this architectural rebellion was the tiled stove, a heat-locking brick oven that stayed warm for hours, releasing slow, steady warmth, sometimes enough to heat an entire floor. That was the moment when the first castles in history could finally maintain continuous warmth, even if only in a handful of rooms. But the real question remains, would you choose the comfort of a small warm chamber, or walk through a grand freezing hall of stone just to maintain the proper noble presence? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy uncovering medieval survival secrets like this, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story.